I will tell you right now, I am going to struggle a little bit to see comments because they are kind of far away now. But when it is time for us to have discussion, I will bring my Periscope camera closer and I will be ending my broadcast on both YouTube and on the Daring Dialogues page on Facebook. So if you want to hear the rest of the conversation, because we went like another 40 minutes after we got off of Daring Dialogues on Facebook. So I am also live streaming on YouTube tonight. I'm also live streaming on Periscope and on the Daring Dialogues Facebook page. Good evening. So we are back in business with the Periscope. Lady Barbara, I'm not sure why, but I'm going to try to stay focused because I can't answer every question about technical difficulties. So we have 3 places where you can go if you're having trouble getting on any of the, like now, my Periscope just shut off. So again, if you're having problems getting on any of the broadcasts, I am on our Daring Dialogues Facebook page. I am on YouTube, youtube.com/churchlove333. And now I'm having to get back into the Periscope tonight, right now. So hopefully those who were on the initial one will come back. So let's set this up again. Welcome to the world of digital streaming. That's not always reliable. All right. So we are back again on our Periscope. Periscope has joined us again. Please share the broadcast out. Those of you who have your Periscope connected to Twitter, you can share it out. You can tweet it out there. Tonight is Black Table Talk, and we are talking all things Black people and Black history. This broadcast is not intended to disparage anybody else, any other ethnos. We're simply having a conversation about us. So if you can't handle a conversation about Black people, this is not the show for you. You can join us tomorrow where we talk about Christian people. And that's Theology Thursday. We actually talk about more than Christians. We're just on Christians right now. We're learning the history of some things in terms of Christianity. That's where we are focused right now. So you can also tune in tomorrow for Theology Thursday. If you want to learn about business and finance, you can tune in on Friday. On Fridays, we cover Healthy, Wealthy, Wise, talking about our body, talking about nutrition, and talking about finances, everything from credit to home ownership to business and entrepreneur insights and tips. So we cover that on Friday. So I am thankful for those of you who are able to join tonight. I do apologize to the Periscope viewers. Sorry about that cutoff. There's something, again, technically happening, but we're trying to work through it so that all of these sites can stream consistently at the same time. So tonight we are going to jump right into Spare the Kids by Dr. Stacey Patton about why whooping children won't save Black America. We already know that this is a touchy subject for Black America. We know why it's a touchy subject because most Black American parents do love their children and they're trying to figure out ways to keep their children safe, right? They're trying to figure out ways to combat a lot of the terrorism that's happening in our society against Black people in general, from women to children to grown men. So we know, yes, there is a need to keep your children safe, but the reality is data consistently shows that beating them is not one of those ways. And so we have to change our course. We have to change our narrative in our brains. We have to reprogram ourselves and decolonize parenting and decolonize how we see children, especially Black children. So we have been on the topic, would Jesus whoop a child? And we've been talking about how some of the English practices came over and was transplanted to the slaves. Again, these were not overall West African practices of how they treated children. These were European practices that were interjected into scripture, and then as slaves began to learn the quote unquote slave master's version of scripture, they were encouraged to take on these methods of child rearing and child care. All right. So again, these were not practices that were indigenous to us as a group of people. So that's where we are going to pick up tonight. We're going to talk about slave preachers and African cultural practices. Slave preachers and African cultural practices. And we're going to talk about the fact of how these preachers during this time, the ones that were initially set up, they were endorsed by the slave masters and they were endorsed by the white preachers of their day because they were trained to present a certain specific kind of gospel. We already know historically that it was not the full gospel because the slave Bible only contained about 20% of scriptures. You can go actually look at the slave a copy of one of the slave Bibles that proves that they were not given the full gospel. They were given about 20% of the text, and that was presented to them as if it was the whole thing. All right. So a lot of deception occurred, which is why people need to stop saying that Black people are following the white man's God. Because first of all, it was never their God to begin with. And second of all, they were not given the full gospel. So I need us to actually stop saying that because it's not true. So let's talk about these slave preachers who were sought out to deceive and give a specific kind of gospel to their fellow slaves. Slave preachers were expected to balance African cultural practices while promoting the plantation gospel to accommodate plantation life. Some slave preachers encouraged slaves to accept their servitude and to expect eventual salvation from white oppression in the next life. That was the script that they were given. Accept the suffering now, and you'll be free in the next life. These types of sermons pleased white masters because they helped to maintain control over the slave community. The slave preachers who were caught cloaking their sermons in secret messages of equality, defiance, and liberation were actually whipped, hanged, and even burned alive. So this whole myth about, there was nobody who was actually rebelling against this system is just not true. All right. The slaves who knew the truth and were learning the truth, who were trying to actually interject the truth to their fellow slaves, were actually whooped, hanged, or even burned alive for daring to go against the script that they were given. Okay? Slave preachers could be dangerous because they had the power to ruin their flock. For example, and we've talked about this before, in 1831, the slave preacher Nat Turner led a rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. Those slaves went from plantation to plantation, stole horses and guns, freed other slaves, and killed up to 60 whites in the process. Turner was captured, hanged, and nearly 200 Black people were killed during the uprising. Denmark Vesey, we've talked about him as well. Another slave preacher who purchased his freedom in Charleston, South Carolina, after winning the lottery, used church meetings to plan an uprising for which he too was executed. So the preachers who started out maybe not knowing the full truth, who came to the knowledge of the truth and decided that they were going to teach these slaves the truth and encourage their rebellion against oppression and tyranny, they themselves died for that gospel. Fearful of future slave insurrections, whites cracked down on black churches meeting openly in many parts of the South, and they're still cracking down today. Anytime you see a black preacher who is preaching a message of liberation, who is preaching a message of freedom, especially along the lines of black liberation, or especially along the lines of financial liberty and freedom, you're going to see white media begin to attack those pastors and leaders. Nothing has changed in that regard, by the way. By slavery's end, the practice of severe physical discipline was already deeply embedded in Black culture. The Black church, perhaps inadvertently, became complicit in violence against Black children as a survival tactic. Between 1877, the end of Reconstruction, and 1950, approximately 4,000 Black people were reportedly lynched. 69% of all victims were between ages 16 and 35, and about 4% were under the age of 16. And white men raped Black girls and women with impunity. The Ku Klux Klan and Night Riders terrorized communities and burned schools and churches. My great aunt shared with me about how our family managed to keep our land in North Carolina. A part of the way they had to keep the land was as these night riders rode through, my great grandfather would go and stand out with his gun and he would guard the property against the Klan. So there is a historical record of this. People just have to open their mouths and share their history with the current generations. Many lynching victims were sharecroppers, community leaders, and ministers who had spoken out against the mistreatment of Black people. So anytime I hear someone saying what the church or what the Black church has not done, I automatically know that they're speaking out of ignorance when they have not done their homework. Because there were a lot of Black ministers who got lynched for speaking the truth and speaking up for Black people. As a social center of segregated communities, churches help Black people to cope with tragedy and their pain while also trying to keep up morale in the face of demoralizing circumstances. They also perpetuated a culture of fear, though. Fear of God, fear of the white man, and between elders and children. Black churches sometimes became spaces where Black folks could achieve status based on a certain or different criteria from society, which these institutions often regarded as corrupt. Lady Mason says, my great grandfather also passed down a horror story about keeping our family land. Yes. So in these self-contained communities, if you followed the rules, you could gain respect in the eyes of other Blacks, your pastor, and of God. Black people, like poor white folks, have long been made to feel like their low status in life is actually their fault. We call this today victim blaming, except when it comes to the Black community. Anything that is happening to the Black community, it is quote unquote their fault. I see very few people actually looking at the external things that cause the issues that we see happening in the Black community. So these people are taught that their low status is their fault. And people who feel like failures are susceptible to embracing a punitive version of Christianity under which they try to beat themselves into respectability. What does respectability politics look like? Respectability politics looks like someone saying, well, if you would just pull up your pants, people wouldn't attack you. Or if you just dressed a certain kind of way, people wouldn't attack you. Or if you just permed your hair and didn't wear it naturally out of your head, people wouldn't attack you. But we seem to forget that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers, by the way, were all wearing suits when they were assassinated. So for some people, it has nothing to do with your clothes. It has everything to do with their perception in their mind that blackness to them is a threat. It doesn't matter if you have a hoodie on. It doesn't matter if your pants are low. It doesn't matter if you have a three-piece suit on. To them, blackness is a threat. So, yes, do we want people to dress decently? Yes. But we also know that in this society, sometimes, regardless of how decently you're dressed, you can still be attacked simply because of the color of your skin. So I want to make that clear. It's a wickedly ingenious concept and an effective way to blame and blind people who would otherwise take more radical steps to free and destroy institutionalized systems of oppression by simply saying everything is their fault. During Jim Crow, Black preachers still had to carefully tailor their sermons, knowing whites were always listening and would close a church and run the minister out of town in a heartbeat. The church had to help Black families adapt to a regime of terror and surveillance, preaching messages that white racists would find acceptable while motivating Black people to endure and survive the terror. Whenever Black churches sought to transcend this role and become open centers of activism and resistance, there was hell to pay. Our churches were brutally attacked during the Civil Rights Movement. Churches in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Virginia, and South Carolina were dynamited and firebombed and gutted by arson. In the mid-1960s, once the Civil Rights Movement slowed and the laws regarding racial segregation were changed, the surveillance and intimidation of Black people began to ease briefly. Black people had some independence in the 1970s and were beginning to find their footing to work for progress. But then Ronald Reagan became president in the 1980s, bringing back aggressive race baiting, chronic poverty, and the prison industrial complex, of which, by the way, Mr. Biden is an author of, with the war on drugs, which have been going on ever since. The 1980s and 1990s brought a fierce white backlash or whitelash to the successes of the civil rights movement, with many of our activist giants either executed, retired, or dispirited, and in some cases expelled from the United States. That racial backlash expressed itself through whites opposing desegregation, through the cutting of social welfare programs, through turning back the clock on civil rights protections. Sounds like 2019. It's the same program for a new generation because people are upset at any of the gains that have been made. We also saw amped up hostility to affirmative action programs in employment and college admissions, which is now happening again. This is the time when many white people started seeing themselves as the new victims of racial oppression, or what they called incorrectly reverse racism. We saw hospitals routinely delivering standard health services to Black people, insurance companies charging Black consumers higher rates than whites for both car and home policies and life insurance. All of that is still happening, by the way. Major food retailers abandoning the inner cities, still happening. This led to the sprawl of food deserts in poor urban communities, the denial of senior level management positions to Blacks, and the elimination of decent paying factory and low skill industrial jobs in once booming cities like Baltimore, Detroit, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, and others. And now in present day, they're calling for, I think, 7,000 jobs to be laid off from Ford. That's recent news. These were jobs that had brought millions of poor and working class people of all colors into the middle class during the first half of the 20th century. When those jobs dried up, Black people were the first to be fired. The retreat from civil rights led to heightened segregation and isolation of Black people in blighted neighborhoods. Real estate firms and banks engaged in residential discrimination. Black working class families who didn't have savings or good credit to purchase homes found themselves now trapped in urban wastelands. Getting a loan to fix a house or start a business meant relying on predatory lenders who took advantage of people with little knowledge of how high rate short-term loans worked. Hence, you have things like payday loans, which is a staple in many blighted urban communities. The only businesses that seem to have survived in inner city communities are barbershops, bodegas, liquor stores, beauty salons, check cashing spots, churches, and funeral homes. And I'll add one more to the list: dry cleaners. High rates of joblessness, poverty, hunger, and homelessness fostered the drug trade. With so few educational and job opportunities, it's not surprising that some young people saw selling drugs as a way out or an only way to make a living. Increased violence from the drug trade overwhelmed communities that were already steeped in now intergenerational poverty. On top of that, Black communities became a target of a war on drugs marked by indiscriminate police violence. The media fueled fear and violence by stigmatizing young Black males as criminals. Federal and state governments responded with severe penalties for drug sales and possessions and by building more prisons. New mandatory minimum sentencing laws required convicted felons to serve long prison terms, and juveniles were increasingly treated as adults. Mass incarceration has now devastated Black families and communities by removing emotional and economic support that was once provided by fathers, leading to lower rates of marriage, leading to higher rates of children being born outside of marriage, and increased rates of Black men fathering babies with multiple women. Thousands of children have been separated from their parents and raised in foster care. And when folks do get out of prison, they now cannot vote, apply for public housing or student loans, or get jobs. Because of widespread unemployment, mass incarceration, and premature deaths of Black men, far too many Black women have been raising children alone. Because we're almost among the lowest paid workers in this country and highly susceptible to layoffs, some Black women have had to rely on welfare and other sources of work, though they are not the main purveyors of being on welfare, which is actually white women, according to statistical data. So, on top of all of these social problems, we witnessed the return of state-sanctioned and vigilante racial violence, fueled by the election and re-election of a Black president and the apocalyptic visions of Donald Trump. If Black people had had the luxury of 20 to 30 years of breathing room after slavery and had been able to parent their children without fear, then perhaps the practice of whooping might have become less widespread. But that never happened. As such, the Black church continues to be a haven and a survival center in many communities, but it has not made much headway in helping us destroy structural racism. Instead, we have blamed the children and we have whooped the children for all of these generational, social, economic, and political problems that were here before they were born. I know that was a lot, wasn't it? A number of Black clergy I interviewed say it's difficult to pin down exactly where the theological origins of spare the rod were fully embraced by the Black clergy. But they say its centrality fits within the larger religious and racial history, one that includes both Black preachers who have linked whippings to Black Christian theology and those who are working to push beyond the violence, calling upon Black parents to find alternative methods of child rearing. Because here's what we understand: everyone else has found alternative methods of raising their children. The writer here says, as I dug deeper into the research for this book, I was surprised to find allies, mainly Black womanist theologians, Black liberation theologians, Black mystics, and of course the non religious, who are working to liberate Black Christianity from the clutches of white theology and expression, and Black ministers who promote those values in their churches. Hallelujah. These kinds of religious leaders have not been given the same level of media attention as Black clergy who publicly support abusing and whooping children. Absolutely right. The toxic child whooping Christianity described throughout this chapter is exactly what many of these clergy have fled and have rejected. Ultimately, they realized that it wasn't the teachings as much as the teachers that alienated and harmed them. Yes, they acknowledged that the Bible was used historically to oppress and is still being used to oppress. But a more evolved and progressive theology sees the teaching for what it is. So there are some Black clergy trying to move out from under the oppressive hand of dogma and tradition to free the gospel and the text from the translators who seize the word and not the spirit of the message. Some of these theologians admit that there's absolutely a culture within evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity that does teach corporal punishment, and it is stronger within marginalized communities of poor and uneducated Black and white people. These churches are safe spaces, refuges, you might say, away from people and things that make the churchgoers feel oppressed. Then they get to church and they beat their kids with the blessings of their pastors. It's a sad irony, but to an adult who feels that this is his or her political, economic, and social power, because the rest of it has been stripped away, whooping a child provides a small semblance of power in the world. Children in those cases are not seen as the future. They are not repositories of unconditional love or blessings from the Father. Rather, they become another thing to be controlled and subdued. One theologian who is addressing the intersections of race, religion, and Black parenting is Lisette Cross, a Baptist minister of a multiracial congregation in Richmond, Virginia, who considers herself a womanist theologian. She is doing her master's research at Union Presbyterian Seminary on Black trauma and the role of religion as a coping mechanism. So we will continue there next week on this chapter. Would Jesus whoop a child? Again, I am reading from Spare the Kids by Dr. Stacy Patton. We're going on to our second book for tonight, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. If you want a definitive study on race, on the origin of these ideas that are still perpetrating themselves and permeating throughout our society today, I suggest you get this book. We are about 20% of the way through it, and we're going to continue tonight. We are in the Jeffersonian age. We're in the quote unquote age of enlightenment. And apparently these people were not really very enlightened. The only thing they were enlightened about was how can we further lie about Black people and their role in society. So the era of enlightenment is starting to look like the era of how can we keep things in the dark? How can we distort knowledge concerning Black people? Yes, that's on my summer reading list, stamped from the beginning. Excellent. So we are on page 86, and we are on, again, the section part 2, Thomas Jefferson and the quote unquote age of enlightenment. And we're going to look at Peter Jefferson as we read on today. And it goes into, we're still talking about Thomas Jefferson as well. Peter Jefferson acquired around 1,200 acres in Virginia's Albemarle County and went on to represent the county in the House of Burgess, Virginia's legislative body. Now, sidebar, because this is important. There are a lot of people who do not understand that we, Black people, our descendants, were the cash, the capital, and the credit for this country. We were the stock and we were the bonds. We were the credit system. We were the actual value, the monetary value that mattered in this country for a very long time. People ask the question, how did we get from, or where did that value go? How did we get from people being valued like that to the current systems that we have today? And we read a previous book called History of the Black Dollar by Angel Rich. I recommend that to anyone who's interested in studying this in detail. But basically, in short terms, the value of land at the time when all of this land and acreage was being given away, including up until the time where immigrants were flocking over here because of this promise of land, land was going for about $1.25 an acre. All right. And the only reason why the land had any value at that time, it was based on the number of people you could acquire based upon how many acreage of land that you had. So at the time, land wasn't worth much. But when they released the slaves and they freed the slaves, that value, that monetary value, went a couple of places. It went to the stock market that was created, and then it also went to land. The value of land increased even though there was no more labor bodies attached to working the land. All right. So this is why people could get land for, can you imagine getting land for $1.25 an acre? And your family, like several families I know still in Virginia, have several hundreds of acres of land now, but their family members were giving it to them it was given to them $1.25 an acre. And how much generated wealth, how much stored wealth now is in that land that was given to them dirt cheap. So the value was placed on the land. All right. But before that, the land did not have much value. That is important to understand. So he acquires 1,200 acres in Virginia's county, goes on to represent Virginia's legislative body. All right. Thank you for the note, Lady Mason. Shadwell, his tobacco plantation, sat about 5 miles east of the current center of Charlottesville. And most of us, hopefully, if you've been alive, you know what happened in Charlottesville recently with the murder of Heather Heyer after the alt-right came through there. The Jefferson home was a popular rest stop for nearby Cherokees and Catawbas on their regular diplomatic journeys into Williamsburg, which I also have been to. The young Thomas Jefferson acquired impressions of attachment and commiseration for them, which have never been obliterated, he reminisced years later. While Thomas was raised on the common site of distinguished Native American visitors, he commonly saw African people as house workers tending to his every need, as well as field workers tending to tobacco. In 1745, Someone brought a 2-year-old Thomas Jefferson out of the Shadwell's big house. Thomas was held up to a woman on horseback who placed him on a pillow secured to the horse. The rider, who was a slave, took the boy for a ride to a relative's plantation. This was Thomas Jefferson's earliest childhood memory. It associated slavery with his comfort. The slave was entrusted with looking after him, and on his soft saddle, he felt safe and secure, later recalling the woman as kind and gentle. When he played with African boys years later, Thomas learned more about slaveholding. As he recalled, quote, the parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose to his worst passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. In his home, no one around him saw anything wrong with the tyranny. Slavery was as customary as prisons are today. Few could imagine an ordered world without them. Peter Jefferson had accumulated almost 60 captives by the 1750s, which made him the second largest slaveholder in Albemarle County. Peter preached to his children the importance of self-reliance, oblivious of the contradiction of relying on slaves for his every need, to which he credited his own success. Peter did not, however, preach to his son the importance of religion. In fact, when Virginia's first Great Awakening reached the area, it actually bypassed the Shadwell plantation altogether. Peter did not allow Samuel Davies, who almost single-handedly brought the awakening to Virginia, to minister to his children or to his captives. It is likely that Peter believed, like many of his slave-holding peers, that Christianizing the Negroes makes them proud and saucy and tempts them to imagine themselves upon an equality with the white people. So tell me again about how all of these people wanted the slaves to learn Christianity. The reality is the majority of them did not. As Davies reported in his most celebrated sermon in 1757, some American planters had been sold on Davies' viewpoint that some should be masters and some servants, and therefore they were more open to converting their captives than before, but not enough of them to satisfy Cotton Mather's like-minded missionaries who agreed with Davies that a good Christian will always be a good servant. Enslavers commonly let slaves live on in their pagan darkness. Mind you, their quote-unquote pagan darkness was because they were not speaking English. So what they called pagan darkness, many of the slaves actually came over having their own faith system. Again, some of them were Hebrews that came over, and some of them were of the Islamic faith. So just because they didn't speak English did not mean that they did not have their own legitimate faith beliefs and practices. All right? I want to make that clear. Fearing Christianity would incite their resistance, they observed a visiting Swede, Peter Kalm, in the late 1740s. 20 years later, irritable Virginia planter Landon Carter fumed about blacks being, quote, devils, and adding, to make them otherwise than slaves will be to set devils free. Not all Christian missionaries were protecting slavery by preaching Christian submission in the mid-18th century. In 1742, New Jersey native John Woolman, a store clerk, was asked to write a bill of sale for an unnamed African woman. He began to question the institution and soon kicked off what became a legendary traveling ministry spreading Quakerism and anti-slavery. After his first Quaker mission in the harrowing slaveholding South in 1746, Woolman jotted down some considerations on the keeping of Negroes. He said, quote, "We are in a high station and enjoy great favors than they. God had endowed white Christians with, quote, distinguished gifts. By sanctioning slavery, America was, quote, misusing his gifts. Woolman planted his groundbreaking abolitionist tree in the same racist soil that pro slavery theologians like Cotton Mather, who was preaching divine slavery, had used a century ago. Their divergence over slavery itself obscured their parallel political racism that denied Black people self determination. Mather's pro slavery theological treatise proclaimed masters divinely charged to care for the degraded race of natural servants. People always ask this question about why does it feel like some white people think that they are the divine caretakers of everybody else, that they are the final word on what is good and true and right? Because many of them have been taught that. Okay? They have. Many of them have been taught that they are the divine caretakers of everybody else. All right? It is false doctrine, but you have to deal with it. Okay? And they may not realize that generationally, that is where their mindset comes from, but that is the theology that has been passed down in this country for centuries. Centuries. That means it's a stronghold. So when you find yourself feeling like a white person is policing your behavior, policing your attitude, policing your voice, policing your whatever it is, understand it is a stronghold. It is a generational stronghold. All right? So they actually believe that they were divinely charged to care for everybody else because everybody else was less than them. Okay? Woolman's anti-slavery treaty proclaimed Christians to be divinely charged with greater favors to emancipate, Christianize, and care for the degraded slaves. But whether they were to be given eternal slavery or eventual emancipation, enslaved Africans would be acted upon as dependent children, reliant on white enslavers or abolitionists for their fate. Hence, the term childism, right? Treating adults as if they are children or calling them boy and girl. Every now and then, when you get into a debate with a white Christian, they'll resort to childism. Just pay attention. They will. All right. John Woolman bided his time before submitting his essay to the press of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Woolman knew the history of Quakers quarreling over slavery, of abolitionists disrupting meetings and being banished. He cared just as much about his Quaker ministry and Quaker unity as he did anti-slavery. In 1752, when abolitionist Anthony Benezet was elected to the press's editorial board, Woolman knew the time was right to publish his 8-year-old essay. By early 1754, Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania Gazette, was advertising the new publication of Some Considerations of the Keeping of Negroes. By the end of the year, some Quakers had started to move like never before against slavery, pushed by Benezet and Woolman and the contradictions of Christian slavery. Benezet had edited Woolman's essay. If Woolman thrived in privacy, Benezet thrived in public, and the two reformers made a dynamic duo of anti-slavery activists. In September of 1754, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting approved for publication the, quote, epistle of caution and advice concerning the buying and keeping of slaves. So, in 1754, people are putting out a notice and warning people about this practice. Yeah. In the epistle, anti-slavery reformers struck a compromise urging Quakers to buy no more slaves. So they said, look, We can't control everybody. We can't convince everyone that this is wrong, but here's what the Quakers are not going to do. Don't buy any more slaves. The writers evoked the Golden Law on the 66th uncelebrated anniversary of the Germantown Petition. Benazet initiated the writing of the epistle and incorporated input from Woolman. Hundreds of copies were shipped to the quarterly meetings in the Delaware Valley. The front door of American Quakerism had officially been opened to anti-slavery. But Quaker masters quickly, slammed the doors to their separate rooms. 70% of them refused to free their captives. Woolman learned firsthand of their dogged refusal when he ventured into Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. Slavery's defenders began to spew many racist ideas, ranging from blacks being a backward people to them living better in America than in Africa, a current trend today. And of course, they added in the quote unquote unbiblical curse of Ham, because it's not in there. It troubled Woolman to perceive the darkness of their imagination. He never faltered in shooting back. In his calm, compassionate way, he said, "No one is inferior in God's eyes." Sounded like he was maybe one of the few actually reading the Bible at the time. They had not imported Africans for their own good, as demonstrated by their constant abuse of them, overwork of them, starvation of them, and scarcely clothing them. So to even say they were doing better in America than they were in Africa was a blatant lie. Because you brought them from the safety of their own communities and villages and you abused them. Yeah. In 1760, Woolman traveled to the Rhode Island homes of some of colonial America's wealthiest slave traders. Their smooth conduct and superficial friendship nearly lured him away from anti-slavery. He ventured back home to New Jersey as he had done from the South years earlier, dragging a heavy bag of thoughts. In arguing against slavery over the years, he found himself arguing against African inferiority and thus arguing against himself. He had to rethink whether white people were in fact bestowed a high station in life. In 1762, he updated considerations on keeping Negroes. "We must speak out against slavery from a love of equity," Woolman avowed in the second part of the pamphlet. He actually dropped the rhetoric of greater favors in a racial sense, although it remained in a religious sense. His anti-racism shined, quote, "placing on men the title slave, dressing them in uncomely garments, keeping them to servile labor, tends gradually to fix a nation in the mind that they are a sort of people below us in nature," started Woolman. But whites should not connect slavery with, quote, "the black color and liberty with the white. Because, quote, where false ideas are twisted in our minds, it is with difficulty that we get fair disentangled. In matters of right and equity, the colors of a man avails nothing." His anti-racism was ahead of his time, like his passionate sermons against poverty, animal cruelty, military conscription, and war. But Woolman's anti-slavery in the 1750s and 1760s was right on time. For the American Revolution, in a political upheaval that forced freedom fighters of Thomas Jefferson's generation to begin to address their relationships with slavery. As we close tonight, I have a few more paragraphs I'm going to read, which will actually end this chapter. Dr. Thomas Walker's remedies did not work, and when his patient, the 49-year-old father of Thomas Jefferson, died on August 17, 1757, it was an unbelievable sight for all who had heard the family lore of Peter Jefferson's strength. The 14-year-old Thomas had to run his own life. As the oldest male, he now headed the household according to Virginia's patriarchal creed. But by all accounts, the 37-year-old Jane Randolph Jefferson did not look to her 14-year-old son for guidance or to Dr. Walker, the estate's overseer. She became the manager of 8 children, 66 enslaved people, and at least 2,750 acres. Jane Jefferson was sociable, fond of luxury, and meticulous about keeping the plantation's records, traits that she then bestowed upon Thomas. In 1760, Thomas Jefferson enrolled in the College of William and Mary, still in Virginia, where he thoroughly immersed himself in Enlightenment thought, including its anti slavery ideas. He studied under the newly hired 26-year-old Enlightenment intellectual William Small of Scotland, who taught that reason, not religion, should command human affairs, a lesson that would inform Jefferson's views about government. He also read Buffon's Natural History, and he studied Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Isaac Newton, a trio he later called the three greatest men the world has ever produced. When Jefferson graduated in 1762, he entered the informal law school of Virginia's leading lawyer, George Wythe, well known for his legal mind and taste for luxury. Admitted to the bar at just 24 years old in 1767, Jefferson stepped into the political whirlwind of the House of Burgess, representing Albemarle County like his father. The Burgess protested England's latest tax imposition, prompting Virginia's royal governor to close their doors on May 17, 1769. Jefferson had only been seated in this government for 10 days. Even after he lost his seat, he actively participated in growing hostilities against England and to slavery. He took the freedom suit of 27-year-old fugitive, Samuel Howell. Virginia law prescribed 30 years of servitude for the first generation biracial children of free parents. Let me say that again for all the biracial folks in my audience. Virginia law prescribed 37 years of servitude for the person that decided to introduce biracial children into their generational lines for free people. To prevent that abominable mixture of white man or woman with Negroes or mulattoes. Howell was second generation, and Jefferson told the court that it was wicked to extend his slavery because, quote, under the law of nature, all men are born free. Wythe, the opposing attorney, stood up to his rejoinder. The judge ordered Wythe back down and ruled against Jefferson. The law in the colonies was still staunchly pro-slavery, and racial laws were becoming staunchly segregationist. But then suddenly, a Boston panel of judges reversed the ideological trend. That man, however, his decision was not reversed. So, next week, we're going to talk about Black exhibits. We're going to be talking about Massachusetts, what happens in Massachusetts, what happens with the well-known writer now, Phyllis Wheatley, and how the decisions that are happening in Boston will begin to affect the nation. This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I have been your host tonight, Shante Charles. I hope that you will pick up a copy of either one of these books and read along with us and learn along with us as we take a look at all of these ideas that are still permeating throughout our society. If you want to continue the conversation with us, you can head on over to pscp.tv/Life Nation. We're on Periscope, and we're going to be taking some calls on tonight. Take care, and thank you for tuning in. God bless.